month. Thanks to COVID, everything's virtual. So if any one of you guys would be interested in joining my user group, let me know. Once again, I'll share the link. And there are other details about me, about how you can connect with me, and I will talk about those later. But one thing I will ask you to do is, if you want to learn around the Power Platform, there are some really good YouTubers out there. One of them is also Reza, so give this guy also a chance. Okay, let's move ahead. So the topic for today is building performant Power Apps, and first we will look at our agenda. The agenda is we're going to focus on various topics related to performance in Power Apps. We will look at delegation, how we can optimize controls, formulas, how we can do some sort of caching. And finally, we will wrap it up with some key takeaways and learning resources that will help you go back to your existing apps and improve the performance of your apps, or the next app that you build, you should take all of these points into consideration. That's the goal of this session. Okay, why worry about Power Apps performance? Now, before I start my session once again, I want to raise of hands quickly, and I see one hand has already come up. My question here is, how many here have built apps using Power Apps? And when I say built apps, I don't mean just went to SharePoint and said create an app and just the out of the box app or a template. You've actually gone ahead and built an app from scratch. How many have actually done that? Quickly raise your hands, quickly, if you've done that. Okay. Okay, so wow, we got quite an audience here now. All right, okay, and the remaining ones who've not raised their hands, I'm assuming they know about Power Apps, they've heard about Power Apps. At least you have a basic understanding of what Power Apps is. So first question is, why should I worry about performance in Power Apps? And the answer to that is actually in the what. So what is Power Apps? Everybody knows this. Power Apps is a low-code application development platform where you can rapidly build apps, and these apps can be deployed and ready globally on the web as well as on any mobile device. All of this in a low-code, no-code development experience fashion, right? In Power Apps, you act on your data. You connect to your data, you build your app, you hit that magic publish button, and your app is ready to go. Now, the three key things that I have highlighted right here in this slide, which I've kind of made the font bold and bigger: connectors, mobile, and low code. These three things are key in the definition specifically related to performance. So the first point was connectors. Connectors allows you to connect to your data sources or your services no matter where they live. Office 365, other cloud services, or on-premises systems. Connectors allow you to connect to your data source. Point number one. Key point number two. Power Apps is designed with the mobile experience in mind. You have a mobile app and you can run your apps directly on your mobile device. And point number three is it is sold as a low-code, no-code development platform, which is true, but there are certain caveats to it. So in connectors, if I'm connecting to my data source, a connector is nothing but a proxy around an API at the back end. So without you realizing, there is an API call that goes across at the back end to connect to your data source. That means there is some query going on when you connect to your data source. And optimizing that query is key in getting optimal performance. From a mobile standpoint, if Power Apps is designed with the mobile experience in mind, what happens if my network connection is poor? How much data can I store locally? What happens if I perform a query that has 1 million records in my backend data source? What happens if my query returns 10,000 records? What happens, right? I'm on a mobile device. How much memory do I have? How much bandwidth do I have? How does Power Apps handle all of this? And finally, it is sold as a low-code, no-code development experience, which is true. But trust me, as in my consulting life right now, which is now 3 years with the Power Platform, specifically around Power Apps, when I go to customers, and many a times I come across scenarios wherein Reza, the performance is not good. Power Apps does not work for us. It was great on day one. It's not working anymore. No, it's not Power Apps that's not working. It is purely because the app maker did not take anything into consideration related to performance and optimization. At the end of the day, what's our goal? Our goal is we are given a job, we got to finish it and move out. True or false? Depends. It depends on the person who's building the solution. But the reality is You need to take into account performance and optimization for every app that you build, because you never know how your data is going to grow at the back end. So these are three key points that I want you guys to keep in mind as we move across the session. Now, what are connectors? Kind of gave you a brief overview of this. It's just a way in which you can connect to your data source. There are over 375 plus connectors available today and growing. Connectors are classified as standard, premium, and preview. Those are licensing aspects. And you can also go ahead and create your own custom connectors. Now, the key thing to note is when I connect to a data source, no matter what my data source is, SharePoint, SQL, OneDrive, Planner, whatever, in reality, there is something happening at the back end. Whether you like it or not, there is something taking place. Now, what's happening? When I sign into my app, and let's say my app connects to SharePoint, I'm going to use SharePoint purely because my demos today are around SharePoint, but the concept that I'm going to explain is the same no matter what your data source is. So when I connect to SharePoint as a data source, for example, and I log into my application, the first thing that's going to happen is when the Power App connects to that data source, it actually makes an OData request. What's an OData request? An open data protocol API call that goes across in the backend without you realizing. That call goes to Azure API Management. Azure API Management handles that incoming request, routes it to the respective connector layer that has been defined. That in turn goes ahead and performs the query on my data source. It gets the data back in the connector, gets it back to Azure API Management, gets it back to my app. So as you can see, whenever you make a request in your Power App to your data source, you're querying your data source, you're filtering your data source, you're sorting your data source. When you are connecting to your data source, there is something happening at the back end, and that is that OData request that goes out. So there is time that gets elapsed when you make your request and when the response comes in. How best to make this call so that the response is optimal is key in designing performant apps, especially in scenarios when your data sources are large. Now comes the first concept, and this is the concept of delegation. If you are working with large data sources, what do I mean by large data sources? How many here, and you can again quickly raise your hands, even a few people do that, it's fine. How many here are aware of the 500 item limit in Power Apps? There's a delegation limit. How many here know about it? Okay, folks do know about it. And if you would have noticed, many a times I've seen this, consultants get a request, hey, my app cannot load more than 500 data. And what does the consultant do? This goes in and changes the limit to 2000. Why? Because that's the available limit. And everything's good for another 2-3 months. The moment the data hits the 2000 limit, guess what? We are all complaining again. So it's very important to know that there are limits, and that limit is known as delegation. And we're going to look at that in detail right now. So what is delegation? Delegation, the name itself is a giveaway. Delegation, as the name suggests, is the ability of Power Apps to delegate the processing of the query to the data source rather than performing the query locally in memory. Example, go to my OneDrive and get all my files, just as an example, right? That query has to be performed in OneDrive. If Power Apps has to perform that query, then in that case, Power Apps is not delegating the work. Get me all the items in my SharePoint list that were created in the last 7 days. If that query has to be performed by Power Apps has to load the entire data set and then perform the query. Why not delegate the work to the backend data source, right? Let SharePoint do the work and only return the result set back to me. That's what delegation is. So a delegable Power App can handle large queries purely because the Power App is not doing the work. The work is being done by the data source, server side. I don't want to do the work client side. Remember, Power Apps running on mobile devices. You don't want Power Apps to load 1 million records and perform a query on that. And that's the reason why there are limits. So working with large data sets requires certain data sources and formulas that you need to leverage which actually support delegation. Okay? That's the concept of delegation. Delegate the work to the data source. The work of what? The work of performing the query. Okay, what if I cannot delegate the work to my data source? What happens in that case? Well, in that case, Power Apps has a limit that the product team has defined. That limit by default is 500, which can be increased to 2000 by the app maker. Okay, so as an app maker, you can go and change that setting, but you cannot increase beyond 2000. That's the maximum limit. So let me give you a scenario. I have a data source that exceeds 500 records, and I perform a query against that data source, and that data source does not support delegation. Let's say I have 1000 records in my data source. My delegation limit is 500. Okay, my delegation limit is 500. In that case, if I perform a query against that data source and that query is not delegable, what will happen is Power Apps has to do the work. So Power Apps will only load the first 500 records in memory, okay? Ignore the remaining 500 items in the data source, and then perform the query on those first 500 records. Okay, that's what Power Apps will do. So if my data source has 1,000,000 records, and if I perform a query, it will only load the first 500 and then perform the query. It's very important to understand. It doesn't perform the query and then load only 500. No, it just loads the first 500 records and then performs the query, which in most cases will give you false positive results purely because it has royally ignored all the data in your backend. Very important to understand this concept. So the outcome will be Power Apps will load only the first 500 records and perform the query. Now that we've understood that what delegation is, delegation means let the data source do the work, and there is a limit if my query is not delegable. So I need to be very, very vigilant about this while building my apps. Now the next question is, which data sources support delegation? Do all data sources support delegation? The answer is no. Currently, as of today's what, the 19th of September, 11:15 a.m. Pacific, only 3 data sources support delegation. The first one is the Common Data Service, the CDS. Second one is SharePoint. Third one is SQL. Now, for the folks who have been really observant while my slides were flying out, if you notice, CDS and SQL have a little diamond symbol on top of them. That is because they are premium connectors. So in reality, the only data source that supports delegation today and that does not require premium licensing is SharePoint. However, for the CDS, there is a new concept coming out that will be rolling out in Ignite. It's already been announced, Project Oakdale, which will give you access to CDS within the context of Teams for free. So yes, in reality, you can use CDS in those kind of solutions because you won't need the premium licensing. This is purely from a licensing perspective. However, all of these 3 data sources support delegation. Also, if any other data source in future supports delegation, then the connector documentation would specify it. Every connector is listed out on docs.microsoft.com, and whether or not it supports delegation or not is also specified. Don't go reading about it. Only these 3 support delegation for now. One more point to note. Imported Excel files. When you import an Excel file, a static file into your app, those do not fall under the delegation realm purely because that data is held locally in the app. Very important to understand, right? I can have an Excel file that has 10,000 records. I'm importing it into my app. There is no delegation issue there. But don't forget, all that data is being held in the app. So if I run it on my mobile device, it's being held in my memory. Collections and tables, those are held in memory. Variables, those are held in memory. Anything that is held in memory will not give you any delegation warnings. That does not mean that it is not running into a delegation error. For example, if I have a collection and if I perform a query against my data source, when I get that data into a collection at a time, when I say at a time, when you perform a query and try to load data into a collection, clear, collect, or collect, can only hold a maximum of 2,000 records. Please note this. However, if I stitch multiple collect operations together, so collect into my collection, the first 2,000 records, collect into my collection, the next 2,000 records, so on and so forth, my collection can grow as large as you want. However, please note, if you try that technique, you are loading data in memory. For someone running on a mobile device that does not have optimal memory size, he or she would run into those performance issues. Okay. 3 data sources support delegation. Great. That means any function in SharePoint, any query in SharePoint, CDS, SQL, I'm good. Well, the answer to that is also a maybe. So just to confuse you further, not just the data sources, you also have to take into account the functions associated with the data sources. The screenshot that you're looking at right now is related to SharePoint. So as far as SharePoint goes, when you perform these query operations, filter, sort, lookup, and so on and so forth, and also depending upon the type of the columns you're dealing with, it may or may not support delegation. So you have to be aware of a lot of factors when you are building your app. Here's a few examples. Every data source is different, and that means the associated delegable functions will also vary. For example, the in operation, the contains operation query is not delegable in SharePoint. Count rows is not delegable with SharePoint. There are certain functions that are just not delegable purely because the backend APIs don't support it. And that's the reason why they are not delegable. And Sahil puts a really good link in the chat window. So I would definitely check that out. Okay. The next thing is filter, search, and lookup are delegable functions. So when you're shaping data, when you're querying data, you typically use these three functions, filter, search, and lookup. They are delegable. However, it depends on the type of query you're performing in those functions. Certain functions like if, modulus, left, they are just not delegable by design. And that same link that Sahil has put, I also have it on my screen. Okay, so I know that there's delegation. I know that it depends on data sources. It could be function related. It could be column related. So much confusion here. How do I come to know if my app is actually running into a delegation warning or not? So how do I identify a delegation warning? My stress is on the word warning. The reason is because delegation is just a warning. It is not an error. You can build an app, publish an app, push it out to all your users in the organization. They all could be using your app purely because delegation is a warning. It's not an error. Okay. So how do I check for delegation warnings? First thing is the Power Apps app checker. Okay, the Power Apps app checker will clearly tell you where you are running into delegation warnings and which formulas and in which screens. Second, when you are writing your formulas in the formula bar, as you are writing your formulas, if your formula is not delegable, you will see a blue dot error in the formula bar. Right here, if you notice the screenshot that I've shared, I have a blue dot error right here. It clearly tells me, it's a visual cue, that the formula that you're writing is not going to be delegable against the data source that you are running this formula under. Third one is look for the hazard symbol warnings on screens. So when you build these multiple screens, if there are delegation warnings on the screens, you will see this little yellow hazard symbol. That is again a visual cue telling you that you are running into delegation warnings. And number 4, which is a trick that I use in most of my projects, the delegation limit by default is 500. I go ahead and I actually change it to 1. And the reason why I change it to 1 is if my query is not delegable, I will never get more than 1 record. And quickly I can identify that there is something wrong with the query. So the 4th one is not a foolproof solution. It's just one way of identifying a delegation warning. The first 3 definitely are. And the key to all of this, guys, is the responsibility is on the app maker to handle delegation. Folks who are using your app, consuming your app on the mobile devices, browsers, none of them are going to get any delegation warnings. They are not going to get any visual cues. The person who's building the app, the responsibility of handling delegation is up to them. If they ignore these delegation warnings, that means they are accepting that these queries will not run against large data sets, period. Now, let's look at a quick demo on delegation. So here's my scenario. I have an app that connects to SharePoint as a data source. My SharePoint list is called students. I have over 5,000 records in my SharePoint list. And I have created the students list with various columns right here. Now, first things first, in SharePoint, I'm sure many of you guys would have observed that there is the 5,000 view limit, right? But you don't run into issues in modern SharePoint. And the reason is because in modern SharePoint, right, you can see a certain set of records. And as you scroll down, it will load the next set of records. This is known as optimized loading. That means it will only load data in batches. That way it keeps the data set low. and the performance optimized. This is what SharePoint does at the back end, and that's what modern SharePoint had to do to avoid those limitations of classic SharePoint. Okay. Next thing is, let's go to our Power App. So my Power App is connecting to that same students list that has more than what, 5,000 records in my data source. Okay. Please note, I only have 5,000. SharePoint list can handle up to 30 million. So in reality, it could have even been 30 million. The result would be the same what I'm demoing right now. Okay. So in this case, on my home screen, I have a very simple gallery. And this gallery right now, let's go ahead and first perform a very simple query, which is directly give the items property of the gallery to that students list directly. Okay. Now, if I play the app, okay, my gallery is loading all the records. And if I go to file and if I go to settings and if I go to advanced settings, the number one setting is delegation. And notice my delegation limit is 5. Let's say I change this to 1. Okay, my best practice, I change this to 1. I'm going to head back to my screen. Now, first things first, I am not running into a delegation warning. How do I know this? All those 4 visual cues, right? I don't see a hazard symbol. My delegation limit is 1. I see more than 1 record. All that good stuff is right here. That means I'm definitely not running into a delegation warning. However, if I'm not running into a delegation warning, let's say my data source has 1 million records, right? In this case, 5,000. How does Power Apps load 5,000 records at once? Do you think Power Apps does that? Imagine I'm running this on a mobile device. I have 1 million records in my backend data source. Do you think Power Apps is going to load all those million records in memory in one go? It won't do that. And just to prove my point, it actually does optimize loading just like SharePoint handles it. Right here, if you see, I have a gallery that is pointing to my data source. I purposely put a formula right here on the top that shows you the count of the number of items of the gallery. So you see the count is 100. And as I scroll down, and if the demo gods are with me, of course, notice on the top is going and performing the second query, and now the item changed to 200. So as the user is scrolling down, it is going and loading data in batches of 100. And that's exactly what SharePoint does as well. This is called optimized loading. The best part is, since my query is supporting delegation, it also supports optimized loading by design. I don't even have to worry about this. I don't have to worry about what's going on here. It's already handled for me by design. So it's very important to understand that if my query supports delegation and if my data source returns, for example, let's say 1 million records, that does not mean that 1 million records are being loaded in my mobile device. No, it only loads data in batches of 100. And if you guys would like to see this in more depth, if you go to the monitoring tool and run the monitor, you can actually see the query at the back end where it is loading data in paginated fashion. Very, very important to note that. And yes, you are right, Manjunath. It is pagination, kind of pagination for the gallery. Okay, that's point number 1. Now, let's say I go ahead and I perform a query. So this time I'm going to say, here's my query. Let me comment this one. And let me perform a query that says, filter my students list where the title is equal to the text that I enter in the search box. The search box is right here. Now, first things I want all of you guys to notice. Number 1, I only see 1 item in my gallery straight away, just 1 item. Second, I see the hazard symbol right here that tells me if I hover on this, there is a delegation warning. Third, if I go back to my formula right here, I get that blue dot error right here, right? And fourth, what was my fourth cue? 1 item. That's what I see. Oh, sorry, app checker. App checker right here. Go to formulas and delegation warning. Right here, I have a delegation warning. So every visual cue is given to you as the app maker. Everything's here. Now I can ignore this and I can publish the app. No problem. But guess what? My users are going to get false positive results. Now in my case, I just said my delegation limit is 1. So I just get 1 record in my gallery. What if I change this? Yeah, I can change this to 5. I can change this to 10, 100, 500. Max I can change this to is 2000. If I even go 1 beyond, it won't allow me. So let's say I change this to 5. I go back and in some time, once my cache refreshes, I should see 5 items right here. Now the key is, if I perform a query to search on a student name, so let's say I search for Anjali, right? And if I perform this query, it will get me the data purely because by luck, the first 5 records had Anjali in it. But if I go back to my students list and let's say I want to search for David. So let's change my search. Let's change this to David. Now it tells me that there is no record in your data source that matches this query. which is incorrect because my data source actually has the value for David. And the reason in this case that we are running into the delegation error is purely because the in operation or the query for in, which is like a contains operator, is just not delegable with SharePoint. However, there is another function called starts with, where you can check to see if the column starts with the text that you're defining. If I play this right now, notice when I enter David, it's got me all the data associated with David, all the students. That's because I'm not running into a delegation warning. Even if I search for a letter which say has a lot of students like A, notice it has still done optimized querying. It just loaded the first 100 students that begin with the letter A. That means even while performing my query, it is still doing pagination for me. All of this magic is happening in the backend at the connector purely because I am respecting delegation. So respecting delegation is key, guys, for you to build apps that scale, for you to build apps that perform. Microsoft has set the default limit for 500. There is a reason for that. It's 500 because 500 records will be loaded in memory if your delegation function is not supporting delegation. If you conveniently change it to 2000, please note 2000 records are going to be held in memory, almost 3 times more than the 500 number. Of course, the performance of your app will go down, right? If someone is running this on a mobile device that does not have great connectivity, great bandwidth, all that work has to be done by Power Apps. Power Apps will take an age, and many a times you'll come to your home screen and you'll see that loading icon running on the top. Okay. Please make sure you understand delegation. Now, I just scratched the surface on delegation right now, to be very honest with you. On my channel, I did a series on delegation. I did this more than a year ago, and still all the content is actually relevant. So I have this 5-part series on delegation, which will explain to you exactly what delegation is and how you can get around the delegation with different scenarios. Okay. How you can do counting, how you can do max value, how you can do sum, average. Many workarounds that I perform in my day-to-day work around delegation. I have put all of them right here. So go out and check these videos out whenever you get time. Okay. Before I move ahead, just want to see if there are any questions. Banu Prasad is asking, number of controls in a screen should be less than 60. Otherwise, we get into performance issues. We can load in data set is less than 2000. Number of screens should be less than 60. Yes and no. Ideally, the number of controls in your app should not exceed 500. I'm getting to that. I have a slide deck on that as well. We'll talk about it. One quick question: if the requirement is to check the keyword is contained in the data source, how can we achieve it without delegation warning? I actually have shown that it's a hacky way of doing it. Unfortunately, there is no efficient way of performing that query. Unfortunately. Okay, unless and until the contains operation is supported by SharePoint. In reality, even SharePoint itself doesn't do it. Please note, Power Apps just connects to the data source. If the data source itself cannot perform those kind of queries in an efficient manner, Power Apps will not be able to do so. Even drop-down combo box value should not be more than 500. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And many a times the workaround for that is don't use a combo box. If you know your values are exceeding 500 or 2000, take the user to a different screen, put a gallery there, let them choose the values from the gallery, right? Galleries support delegation as long as your query is valid. Combo boxes don't. So please be aware of these things. There are many important things here. I'm just scratching the surface right now. Okay, let's go ahead quickly to the next topic of my presentation. So this was delegation. Next one is called controls optimization. Now, someone also asked the questions. We should be reducing controls. We should have 60 controls per screen or 500 controls per app. Now, the first thing is Power Apps, as you are adding controls, right? As you keep adding controls on your screens, you just keep drag and drop those controls. Each of these controls are actually adding HTML to the DOM. What's the DOM? The document object model. The more controls you add to your app, the more time the app will take because it has to generate those controls when the users are accessing those screens. There are also certain controls that are actually complex type controls in the backend, such as PDF viewer, data table, combo boxes, because they have some large execution scripts at the backend. And the more controls you add of those types, the more hit on your performance you're going to get. And it is very important to plan to reduce the number of controls whenever you get an opportunity. So somebody said 60 controls per screen. The recommendation from Microsoft is don't add more than 500 controls to your app. So if my app has 10 screens, don't span beyond 500 controls in all the screens combined. Okay, it's very important to reduce the number of controls. You look on the right hand side, and all of this I'll show you in the form of demos when I actually go to the demo part. Right now I'm just going through the points. You can see right here, both of these are actually going to give me the same output. In this case, I have 5 buttons that I have created. In this case, I have a gallery and just one button control, and a gallery can be given a collection, so it can act like a repeating control. So in this case, I have 5 buttons. In this case, I have 5 controls. In this case, I have 2 controls. Yeah, Reza, I'm only saving 3 controls. Well, yeah, but what if I'm using the same concept in 10 screens? Now I save 30 controls. So you got to be very, very frugal when adding controls randomly on your screen. It's very important to see if there's an opportunity to generalize it. One of the ways is by using galleries. Okay, galleries allow you to add collections of data. They act like that repeating control for the folks who are familiar with InfoPath. They are very, very important because they reduce the number of controls and you can take advantages of what the gallery provides. So here's a screenshot of what this looks like. I'm trying to build tab controls in my form. Both of these look the same, feel the same, work the same way. However, from a performance standpoint, the gallery option is more performant as against the buttons. Trust me, I once saw an app that a customer built. They had like these buttons that they put on the home screen. They had like 50 buttons that they added just on the home screen. They could have added one gallery, given it a collection, and they would have had the same output. You just went in, made the modification, and the speed difference on that home page was remarkable. Another option, apart from galleries, is to use components. Components are reusable building blocks in Power Apps. Please note, components have been in preview for over ages now. I am hoping this goes into GA at Ignite. I'm not sure if that's going to happen. However, you should plan to start using components. Components allow you to build reusable controls. Controls that you use over and over again across screens or now even across apps. You can build components and use them across apps as well. So for example, I can build a header control, I can build a left navigation control, a pop-up control, a footer control. Very common controls that you keep using over and over again in your apps. You can build one component, right, for that. And all the users who are building apps can just reference that component. That way, I'm already reducing controls in my app. Okay, very good point put out by Manjunath. Even custom component via PCF. Absolutely, you can even go ahead and span beyond the component framework and go ahead and build custom components via PCF, which is the Power Apps component framework. Next thing that I want to highlight is reusing the form control. Now, many a times we build apps and we have the form control that we utilize. And what I've also observed is that we try to build multiple forms on multiple screens, one for the new form, one for edit form, one for the view form, right? Because we want to view data, edit data, and create data in our data sets. The key thing to note about the form control is if you've ever observed the form control on the left hand side, if you go to the navigation tree, each control actually has 4 controls within it. The reason is because there is a label associated with each control. There is the actual type of the control. There is an error handling piece. And there is also one extra label in there which shows you the star symbol, the asterisk symbol, when something is required or not. Whether you like it or not, whether your column is required or not, it doesn't matter. All those controls will get created when you add that data card. Now, if I add a form control, for example, with 10 columns, okay, that's 40 controls plus my form control. That's 41 plus a submit button, 42, right? If I try and build the same form control in 3 different screens, that's 120 controls straight away. Why not reuse that same form control for different scenarios? And you can do that by just using these very basic formulas. One of the formulas is new form. So you can change the behavior of that same form control based on your use case. You can make it like a new form. You can make it an edit form. You can make it a view form. You can change its behavior by calling these functions. So don't go and start creating different screens for different for different modes of your form control. Definitely not recommended, because number one, you're reinventing the wheel. Number two, you're adding more controls. Your performance is going to start going down. Now let's look at demos for control optimization. Okay, back to my same student repository. Let's look at how we can optimize the controls. So first one right here is controls optimization. This is that tabbed structure that I was talking about. So in this case, I have 6 buttons that are sitting right here in a group. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The other option I have right here is a gallery control with 1 button. And notice for the gallery, the items is a collection that I'm passing. And this can come from a data source. This is just an example, guys. Just trying to show you why it is so important to reuse things, to use gallery controls, because it can act like a repeating control. So from a user standpoint, it looks the same, it feels the same, the behavior is the same. But from a performance standpoint, there's a big difference. Okay. Next thing that I wanted to talk about was, I'm trying to get back to my form control. So here's the form control in action. Now this form control, if I click on new, it acts like a new form control. So I'm going to say, okay, here's a new student, Reza Dorrani is joining, he likes maths, region north, whatever, submit. So I just submitted data into my data source. Now, if I click on view, this shows me that same record in the view form. If I click on edit, this allows me to edit that same record. If I click new, it will allow me to post a new record. So I am reusing the same form control, and the way I'm reusing it is when I click on new, I'm calling the formula new form, edit, edit form, view, view form, changing the behavior of the form depending upon my use case. Extremely important. Okay. And components, rather than giving a demo and trying to save time, I have done another video series on purely components. So if you ever get a chance, go and check this out. I talk about what are components, libraries, and I even have shared 3 different types of components. And there are many other great components on the community gallery that you can go and check out from many other great MVPs. So go check those out. They are really worth it. Next, I am going to head over back to my presentation. I see questions. I'm going to take it after my session purely because we are running out of time. Next one is optimizing the OnStart function. Now, OnStart in Power Apps is the first function that gets called when your app loads. Okay, it's the first function, and it runs only and only once. It is actually one of the best places where you can plug in formulas that more or less are going to remain static throughout the life cycle of your user session while they are using the app. Okay, so for example, I can store my navigation menu information right here. I can store my my brand colors right here when the app loads, right? I can cache certain data locally in variables right here. Anything that you want to do while the app is loading for the user in the background, go ahead and use the app.onStart function. Now, very important, don't go out querying your data sources right here, right? Don't go out and say, okay, get me all the students whose name begin with the letter A, put it in a collection. Then get me all the students whose name begin with the letter B, put it in a collection. If you're going to do things like that, you're querying your data source. If they don't support delegation, it's going to be even worse. And the user is going to load the app and just keep waiting and waiting and waiting. Make sure you use app.onStart. Many a times I've observed apps where app.onStart is literally empty, and on visible of the screen, they are trying to cache content that is not going to change throughout the life cycle. One of the classic cases for app.onStart is the user's profile. Many a times we require the logged in user's information, right? The ID of the user, the mail of the user, the name of the user. Go and cache it locally when the app loads. Next thing is a function called concurrent. Okay. Now, concurrent is a function that allows you to run multiple functions in parallel, and this significantly improves not just your app start time, but any time that you're using this peculiar function. As an example, if you look at the screenshots that I've shared here, left and right, on the left-hand side, I am querying my data sources and I'm creating 4 collections. Now, in this scenario, because Power Apps tends to run serially, each and every function will be executed in serial. So the first function is called, then it goes to second, third, and fourth. So maybe this takes 4 seconds to respond. Now, if I decorate the same function calls under a concurrent function, what's going to happen is Power Apps is going to do multi-threading. It's going to create multiple threads and execute all those functions in parallel for you. So it is a very useful function for speeding up your load times of your screens of your apps. The key to note about concurrent is don't use concurrent functions if the functions are dependent upon each other. So for example, I'm querying a data source that I get an ID from, and the next query uses that ID to perform another query. Don't do it because concurrent runs in parallel. There is high chances that you will get false results. As long as your functions are not related to each other, add them in the concurrent function. If they are related, make sure they are not in the concurrent function. Formula optimization, right? Now this, guys, I have been a part of the community forum for over 2 years now, and trust me, to date, this is one thing that I always observe in the forums. The question is never around this. The question is some other issue that the user has. And many a times they do this, and I actually go ahead and point out that, guys, please don't do this. And let me explain to you why. Now, many a times when we need data from a data set and we only need one record, we end up doing something like this. We filter our data source, we perform a query, and then we use something called as first filter, first filter, first filter. I have seen this so many times. Okay. Now, what happens in the back end actually when you do first filter? Filter function always returns a collection. Even though your query returns one record, 0 records, 100 records, it doesn't matter. The return data type is a collection. So when I filter my students list, okay, and let's say I perform a query, okay, what Power Apps does, or what the backend engine does, once the query is performed, again, depending upon it is supporting delegation or not, it goes ahead and queries the entire data source, even though it finds this case right here. So let's say David is the 4th item and my records have 10,000 records in my data source. Even though it finds David in the 4th item, it will keep checking until the entire data set has ended. Why? Because I'm performing filter. And after I get the entire data set back, it may be even one record, I'm then using the function first. There is a better way of doing this, and that is called lookup. Lookup is one of the most underrated and underused features. What you can do with lookup, guys, is it actually does the same thing, but with one difference. What it does, the moment it finds the first record, the query stops. So now if David is sitting at position number 4 and I have 1,000,000 records, it's a very optimized query. Reza, what happens if David is sitting at position 1,000,000? Well, yeah, then in that case, the query performance will be the same as this. But at least you're giving yourself a chance. You're giving your app a chance so that it goes ahead and grabs the latest data immediately and returns it back to you. Very, very important. Don't use first filter. Please, please, please go ahead and use lookup. A much, much more efficient way of performing your queries. And both filter and lookup supports delegation, by the way, both of them. Okay. Runtime formulas versus variables. Now, many a times we perform queries. So for example, in this case, I'm saying, go and query my list where the current logged in user is the manager. We use this user token over and over again. Don't do that. This is also an API call. When you say user.email, whether you like it or not, there's a query going on at the back end. It has to go and get the user object every time you perform that query. What are the chances of a user object changing during the user session? What are the chances of your email changing while you're running an app? Almost nil. Why not on App Start, go ahead and set a variable which stores the user's email, and then throughout the app, just go and use that static variable. Performance up. Big time. Delayed load. Now, in older apps that were built prior to April 2020, this feature would be turned off. So please go ahead and turn it on. In any new apps that you build, this is turned on by default. The advantage this feature gives you is that it will only load those controls on the screen. Okay. If this is turned on, it will speed up your app's time because it will only call those functions based on the screen the user is at. If this is turned off, and if I have 10 screens, when I load the app, all the 10 screens will be loaded in memory, all the functions will be fired. Okay, so it will improve your performance no end. So for older apps, I will recommend you to go back and just turn on this experimental feature. Preview feature right now, I think move to experimental. Control dependency. Extremely, extremely important. Now, many a times we build screens and what we say is that this value is dependent on a value in my other screen. When you try and create these control dependencies, when Power Apps is loading a screen, if it finds a formula that is dependent on another screen, it will go and load all the controls of that screen also in memory, whether you like it or not. So if I have one screen which has, let's say, the header which has a color of orange that I'm showcasing right here, every other screen has the same header, and I want to keep the color consistent, so I pointed to the same variable on my home page. Guess what? I'm creating a control dependency. Now the user goes to any screen, it doesn't matter. The home screen will be loaded in memory, decreasing performance. So make sure you don't do control dependencies. Another one is n+1 query. Highly recommend you not to do this. We use galleries, which are great, but within the gallery, we add labels, and for each label, we are performing a query, right? So for example, I have a query right here in a label in my gallery, which says, go to another list and query this list. If you do things like that, if my gallery is loading records in batches of 100 also, think about it, 100 queries are getting fired at the back end for each label that comes across in that gallery. So very expensive operation. Rather than that, store that data set in memory and at least query that local data set. Don't perform queries against your backend data source in those scenarios. You have to optimize. You have to think of ways to manipulate your code logic to improve the performance. Another one, and I know I'm almost at time, another one is delay output on text input controls. Many a times when you're using the text input controls, it has a property called delay output. Let me show you that in the form of demos because we are running out of time. I
So
will
we have
talk about key takeaways.
yeah, 10 more minutes, so we can wrap up it up in 5 minutes. In 5 minutes,
Absolutely.
we can go for
I'll
question.
try and make this quick. Thank you, Bethany. All right, guys. First thing, concurrent. I'm going to play this. I'm going to run this. And come on. Okay. Let's try this again. This did not support me. Come back here. Let's run this. And let's run this. Now, what is happening right here is I am trying to perform my queries. And if you look at sequential right here, I am running code that says go ahead and collect students, right? Students beginning with the letter A, B, C, D, E. And I'm storing all of them locally in memory. Now, none of these queries are dependent upon each other. So what I can do in turn is I can go and fire the concurrent function. All I have to do is just decorate those function calls in another function called concurrent. That's all you have to do to call the concurrent function. As simple as that. Another one that I spoke about was delayed output. In this case, I have a text control. And if you look at the advanced formula and if you search for delay, you see delay output is true. Let me first turn this off and show you the problem right here. Now, if I start typing, let's say I type REZA, notice every keystroke that I make, it is querying or it is actually recording my keystroke, right? Immediately. As against, if I turn this to true, and by default, by the way, all text controls are true now. And let's say I do the same thing again, REZAD, until I stop, it won't record that keystroke. Now, why is this important? Why is this so important? Let me show you why. In the home screen, remember we did this. I have a query right here against my text control. Now this is a text box. If I turn delay output to off, okay, if I turn this to false, notice what's going to happen. Every keystroke that I make will be a query against my data source. This is a query, 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 query. 6 queries while I type the letters Anjali. Whereas in reality, if I had that turned on, if I quickly type Anjali and I stop my keystrokes, it will just fire one query against my data source. It's a lot more performant. It's a lot more optimized. Make sure you have delayed output turned on to true. Very important. Another one that I wanted to talk about was, let me see what I can talk about quickly. Formula optimization right here. This is that filter first thing that I was talking about, right? In this case, filter my students, get me the student whose name begins with David, then get the first student and get David's bio. Yes, it gets you the result. However, I can even query the same thing by using the lookup function. There is a big difference in performance when you are actually making this query. I told you how that works. So it's important to understand these concepts. And since we are running very short on time, let me quickly go to key takeaways. First, understand delegation when working with large data sets. Use caching wherever possible, right? Things like configuration data, users profile, cache it locally in memory. It will improve your performance and cache it in app.onstart. Reduce your network calls, n+1 query. Don't do it. Don't do it. Delayed load. Do it. Turn it on. Avoid control dependencies. Use variables. Don't have a control in one screen depending upon a control in another screen. Both screens will be loaded in memory. Don't do that. Reduce the number of controls. Use galleries. Use components. And another one, which is very important, republish your apps regularly because the product team keeps adding new features like delayed load. Make sure you republish your apps every 6 months for enhanced performance. And why 6 months? If you don't publish your app within a 6-month time span, you cannot even recover your app in case your app fails. Please note this. Best practice, republish apps every 6 months. Learning materials, my delegation playlist. There was a great webinar done by Microsoft on performance. I have put those links right here. In fact, I've put 3 links right here, which talks about performance. More or less covers some of the topics that I covered today, but my cases were more around demos. So I hope you guys liked it. And thank you so much for joining the call today. I know it's extremely late. And
No, it's like a wonderful
details to
session.
connect with you. Thank you.
Your session was very good. Yeah, like if you have any questions, you can unmute on yourself and you can try. You can talk.
Let's first go through all the questions in the chat window because I want to respect all the folks who asked those questions. Okay, so is there any chance from Microsoft that a component can be referenced and in future, if anything is changed in component, all the apps that are using the component will have the change reflected? I know the answer. I can't tell you because it's under NDA. Right now, unfortunately, you have to go back to the component and accept the changes. So the answer to your question right now, Banu, is no. How can use if I customize list forms? So if you customize list forms as well, if you would have noticed the default app that gets created, I believe already handles the new edit action. It uses the same form. Can you provide video URL? Yes, I will paste the playlist links in this chat window shortly. App lifecycle, yes. How can I design reusable component? Watch my playlist. Even if we use repeater control, the control created dynamically based on the number of items and data source. So finally, all the control is added into DOM only. So how to? Well, if you use that repeating control, in reality, yes, it adds those controls in the DOM, but it does so in a much more performant and optimized way. That's how it works. We can't. If you run the DOM, it's more like an on-demand functionality that works. It was awesome. Thank you. Thank you also. Excellent session. Thank you. Reza, can you please share the links in the last slide? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I'm going to share all the links in the last slide. Let me start sharing. And I know this is not that last slide. So let me start sharing my links. Link number 1. I'm sorry, the formatting might look terrible. Links in the last slide are being pasted for you guys. Oops. Let me put this in a notepad and paste it there because I think the formatting is looking really bad. Let me try it once again. Okay, these are the links in a much more cleaner and cleaner manner. Let me go ahead and paste my link in here as well. And for the folks asking about the delegation link, let me also paste the delegation link right here. So all the links are in the chat window, guys. Gonna see if there were any other questions. Thanks, more informative session. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Reza. Thank you. Can you repeat about Power App resubmission? What happens if not republished within 6 months? Okay, so if you do not republish your app every 6 months, so for example, here is my student app. If I go to version history, every time you publish your app, it creates a version. However, if you created the version more than 6 months ago, so here's my one version which was on 2019. Notice restoring is disabled right here. And the reason is because Microsoft wants you to republish your app every 6 months. If you don't do it, you cannot restore earlier versions. So by restoring, you ensure that your app is at the latest version. Even if you're not making any change to your app, I would recommend you every 6 months go in and publish your app once again. Just do it. You can also do it through Power Automate. I know there are new ALM functions coming in which will allow you to do that. So once that comes in, I am sure Microsoft themselves or people like me or someone else in the community will share something useful. Excellent session. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anand. Thank you, Sahil. Thank you, everyone, for hanging around this long and at this time in the night. Really appreciate that. And now anyone who wants to go off mute and ask specific questions, I'm right here.